When my husband and I stepped out of the car, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law greeted us with enthusiastic surprise. "Hey Paul, what's with this car? It's amazing," they exclaimed. "I'm glad you finally decided to join our side of society, but it's quite a leap to buy such a luxury car out of the blue." My husband chuckled and responded, "This isn't my car. It's Jasmine's father's." "What?" my mother-in-law and sister-in-law gasped in unison. As my parents emerged from the car, my in-laws were taken aback by their attire. They were dressed in expensive-looking suits that seemed familiar. "Why are Jasmine's parents dressed in such high-end brands?" they wondered aloud. "I'm Jasmine, a 28-year-old office worker, and I married my husband Paul last year. Paul has always been kind and attentive to me. I was thrilled to marry him, as we share household chores equally since we both work. Paul has lived alone for a long time and is excellent at managing the house. In fact, he's an even better cook than I am, depending on the dish. We support each other and enjoy a very happy life together." However, our blissful married life hasn't been without challenges. My in-laws often get in the way of our happiness. They seem to assume I'm poor and have taken to bullying me. Suspect their assumptions stemmed from our pre-marriage dinner party, where we introduced our families. My in-laws, consisting of my father-in-law, mother-in-law, sister-in-law, and husband, are a family of 4. My father-in-law, a former banker, was quite wealthy, and everything he wore was branded, which they seemed to believe was a marker of status. In contrast, my husband is the only one in the family uninterested in such things. He often buys second-hand clothes online and wears them until they seem like they're worth more than the original price. So when I met my in-laws, their tastes and personalities were completely different from what I had expected, given my husband's more modest approach. I even began to wonder if my husband might have been adopted. It seemed that his long period of living alone was due to his differing values from the rest of his family. He started living independently as soon as he entered college, partly because his family equated wealth with worth. When my in-laws and sister-in-law first met me and my parents, they left a very poor impression. My father runs a small factory, and once they learned this, they ridiculed him. They seemed to believe that because my father's factory wasn't a well-known brand, it must be insignificant and surely poor. They dismissed him outright, implying that a major bank would never offer him a loan. Despite this being our first meeting, their dismissive attitude made me question their character. I would have been furious if Paul hadn't apologized to me beforehand. Paul had already briefed my parents on the situation, so they remained calm even as my in-laws made derogatory remarks about us. It's true that we run a small business, but we manage to keep it going and pay our employees' salaries. My father's company may not be large, but we take pride in our work. When they inquired about my brother, they learned he wasn't available as he was working. They asked if he was on a business trip or working for a reputable company. My father mentioned that my brother works for our family business, which elicited a round of laughter from my in-laws. "So it's a family business?" they mocked. "A family that can't even take a day off must not be running things very well." They continued to make disparaging comments about my family, despite Paul's repeated attempts to shut them down. Eventually, Paul had to end the gathering to stop the abuse. This experience left me with a very negative view of my in-laws. They mocked my family and showed little respect. Despite this, my love for my husband was stronger than any objections. I chose to marry him, despite the challenges and prejudices from his family. As long as I stayed out of my in-laws' way, my husband and I could live peacefully and happily. In fact, Paul shared my frustration with his family's attitude and avoided them as much as possible. We only visited them when absolutely necessary. However, about a year after we got married, it seemed they grew weary of our absence. They began pushing us to interact with them more. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law started coming over frequently, often voicing their grievances and criticisms. "Paul never comes home," they complained. She must be trying to keep him from visiting us. I bet she's envious of our lives. Well, it's no surprise. We live differently from people who are less fortunate. But she should at least give us a grandchild soon. If she doesn't produce an heir, she's nothing more than a gold digger. They would arrive shortly after I got home from work and leave before Paul returned. I usually got home early because of my job, but Paul often worked late and didn't get in until just before 9 p.m. During those 3 hours, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law would visit to berate me. They'd criticize our modest apartment, saying, "Paul works for a good company. You should be living in a nicer house." We felt our home was perfect for us, but they insisted on imposing their standards. They'd comment on the contents of our fridge, saying, "There's nothing fancy here. Where's the caviar?" And belittle me. Why did Paul marry someone so boring and financially strained? They'd threaten me, saying, "If you ever touch our money, you'll regret it. We'll make sure you're erased from society." Their visits were a series of insults and threats, leaving me feeling ridiculed and belittled before they eventually left. I planned to discuss the situation with my husband and hoped he would take action, but despite his efforts, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law continued their visits without showing any remorse. They began ambushing me at my apartment when I came home, making me dread returning each day. Their relentless criticism was taking a toll on me, and their persistence seemed unending. To cope, I spent time at a cafe until my husband finished work, so I could return home with him. However, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law's behavior only worsened. They complain, "You're like a pest, taking away Paul's freedom like that." It was even worse that they waited outside for hours to confront me, which made the situation more unbearable. Paul was so disturbed by their behavior that he even sought help from my father-in-law. Unfortunately, my father-in-law was no different from my mother-in-law. He remarked that having a wife from a less affluent background was unusual for them, and warned that our marriage might be at risk if things continued as they were. Frustrated and feeling cornered, I decided to take drastic measures. Though not something I wanted to do, I resolved to confront my in-laws directly. A few days later, Paul and I went to visit them. When we informed them that Paul was bringing me home with him, my in-laws were overjoyed. However, I was appalled when my mother-in-law greeted me with, "I'm so happy to see Jasmine for the first time in a long time. I don't know what kind of fun it is to be a wife-beater." Over the weekend, as we arrived at my in-laws' house by car, they rushed out to greet us, excitedly commenting on the vehicle. "Hey Paul, what's with this car? It's amazing. I'm glad you finally decided to join our side of society. But buying such a luxury car out of the blue is quite a bold move, isn't it?" Paul chuckled and replied, "This isn't my car, it's just my father-in-law's." When my mother-in-law and sister-in-law saw my parents get out of the car, their jaws dropped. They were taken aback by the sight of my parents in their luxurious outfits. "What an expensive-looking suit," they exclaimed. "I've seen that brand before. It's incredibly high-end. Why are her parents dressed in such expensive clothing?" The shock intensified when my brother stepped out of the car. Standing 6 feet tall and dressed in the same high-end brown suit as my father, he looked like a model. My in-laws' expressions changed as they took in his appearance. "Who's that handsome guy?" they wondered. "Nice to meet you, I'm Simon, Jasmine's brother." My brother introduced himself. My in-laws were frozen, their amazement evident as they compared our family to the last time they saw me. Seeing their reaction, my husband was frustrated. "What are you doing? Show my family around the house immediately," he urged. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law scrambled to accommodate us, hurriedly inviting my family inside. They ushered us into the living room and said, "We'll prepare tea for you right away." Their attitude had completely flipped. They were now intensely curious about my family. "How are you able to afford such luxury items?" they asked, clearly baffled. It was evident they were quick to change their tune based on appearances. My father responded, My factory may be small, but the parts we produce are unique. We receive orders from major Japanese and international companies. His answer visibly unsettled my in-laws, turning their faces pale. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law suddenly became quite cordial towards me, while my father-in-law remained silent throughout. My sister-in-law, now very interested in my brother, engaged him in conversation. "So, what kind of work do you do at your father's company?" she'd asked. "I've always excelled in English and currently manage business meetings with overseas companies, which means I spend about half of the year abroad." "That's impressive," my sister-in-law said. "Are you single, Simon?" "No, I'm married," my brother replied. "That's too bad," she continued. "I think I'd be a better match for you than your wife. What do you say we go out for dinner sometime?" Her boldness was astonishing, and despite being taken aback, couldn't help but admire her audacity. However, I was determined to put her in her place immediately. My brother looked at me and gave a slight nod. He then addressed my sister-in-law. "Are you kidding me? You think you're a better match for me than my wife? My wife is a former model, highly educated, and the daughter of a president of a well-known company. No matter how you look at it, you're not in her league." He added, "It's funny how some wealthy people misunderstand their own worth, isn't it? I won't say anything bad about you, but you should know your place and stick to what's appropriate." His words struck home, leaving my sister-in-law visibly shaken and speechless. She seemed on the verge of fainting from the shock. Finally, my father turned to address the situation with the rest of the family. "I don't care about the wealth of other families. While money is important, it's not the sole measure of a person's worth. We should focus on being human and not let our lives be consumed by material wealth." "I'm sorry for how we were today," my father said, bowing in apology. My in-laws were visibly stunned and quickly backed off. Since then, they've never tried to bully me again. In fact, they now regularly reach out to flatter me, which can be a bit overwhelming. Neither my parents nor my brother are the type to flaunt their wealth or wear luxury brands. They supported my plan this time, but it's not their usual style. My father prefers to wear a well-worn suit, regardless of its cost, and has no interest in high-end fashion. My brother is kind and never mocks others, which is why his father-in-law holds him in high regard. In fact, he's even asked my brother to consider taking over the family business, believing he would be a better heir than his eldest son. I'm sorry for putting my family in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable situation. Everyone was exhausted by the time we got home. Thankfully, I was able to return to a peaceful married life with my husband. Since then, I haven't visited my in-laws, though my husband makes the trip to see them during Thanksgiving and Christmas. After that event, they seem to change. They no longer flaunt their wealth as they once did. It's possible they've lost their confidence, or perhaps they've genuinely repented. My husband even says he feels more at ease with them now. While I can't be certain they won't revert to their old ways, I'm grateful that the issue has been resolved. For now, I'm focusing on caring for my husband and family, and living with a sense of modesty. They once believed they were superior, but it turns out that other family members have achieved far greater success. The in-laws should reflect on their behavior. It would be humiliating to continue belittling others based on their financial status. I'm glad we addressed the situation, and I hope we can all continue to live in harmony and appreciate each other's worth.